There's one massive problem I have with the Jack the Ripper DLC, and it's a problem that kind of annoys me. That problem is it's too damn short. I've always noticed that Assassin's Creed Syndicate was a game of mixed reviews, not just by myself but in the public opinion. It was not groundbreaking or anything, mainly because it stuck to a formula that needed a change, and the parkour was a bit questionable. But there's one thing that really stands out about this game, and that is its setting. Just think about it for a second. Victorian London. What's the most recognizable aspect associated with this era? Is it the manual labour, the Queen, the buildings, or maybe the fact that it once featured Jack the Ripper? You see, when you choose Victorian London as a backdrop, it's almost obligatory to incorporate one of history's most infamous serial killers. A serial killer whose true identity remains in mystery to this day. Well, not in Assassin's Creed. You see, this franchise does a good job of taking once historical events, as well as figures, and adding a fictional twist to it. So when Ubisoft announced a Jack the Ripper DLC for this game many years ago, how could I not be excited? Now what I want to do in this video is give my opinions on this DLC, whether it's the positives or even the negatives. But before we dive in, I'd love to hear your opinions on this DLC. Are you a fan of it or are you not? If you're not, comment below what your favourite DLC is in Assassin's Creed. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into it. Anybody who's familiar with Batman's Scarecrow will notice a concrete similarity with Jack the Ripper in this DLC, albeit a more low budget version. The Jack the Ripper DLC starts 20 years after the events of the main game and features 10 new story missions. But if I'm being honest, these missions really flew by quite quickly. Could that be because of how enjoyable they were? Maybe. Now, the main focus on who our protagonist is in this DLC is on one particular character, being Evie Frye. Now, if anyone had doubts on if she was a great protagonist in the base game, surely this DLC answers those questions. But if I'm being honest, as a protagonist, her status gets elevated quite a lot throughout the Jack the Ripper DLC. You see, since this DLC is presented 20 years after the base game, this meant we'd see a more middle-aged set of Frye twins, and it definitely does show. I mean, they've got all the wrinkles and imperfections, yet strangely, Evie still is able to traverse the bloody streets of London with this very undeniable sense of swagger. So with the Templars out of the picture in London, a new menace emerges, a serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, who's been terrorizing the city with horrific murders. Luckily, the sibling duo Jacob and Evie are on the case. Now the DLC kicks off with an older and you'd assume wiser Jacob, who's hot on the trail of Jack the Ripper. For the first few minutes, we follow Jacob's pursuit until the hunter becomes the hunted. We see Jack flip the script, overpowering and eventually capturing Jacob. Fast forward a few weeks later, and Evie arrives back in London. Now she's been living in India with her husband Henry Green for the past 20 years since the events of Syndicate. She then finds out about Jacob's disappearance and sets out to find her brother and confront the madman who abducted him. So the idea is for her to unravel the mystery surrounding Jack the Ripper and put an end to his gruesome spree once and for all. And that's essentially the basic surface level explanation of what the story would consist of. The actual main story for this DLC is a lot different to the whole Crawford-Stark dealio from the base game. Not just because both the Frye twins are significantly older, but because the entire premise of how Jack the Ripper is presented is a lot different. It gives off a very horror-esque vibe to it, instead of the lighter-hearted themes from the base game. One thing I do like about the missions in this DLC are some of the areas it takes us to, like a snowy manor outside the city, and even old warships turned into prisons. These were definitely a refreshing change of pace from Victorian London, and they did kind of remind me a lot of the Captain Kidd locations from Assassin's Creed 3. And then in terms of the actual Jack the Ripper character himself, it's very interesting to see the Assassin's Creed twist involved into it. In real history, Jack the Ripper was a mysterious individual that nobody could really identify. Sure, there's recently been people claiming to know who the killer was, but it's all lies. Part of what makes Jack the Ripper so chilling is the ambiguity. Nobody really knows the reasonings behind the killings. If anything, we only go off what we're told, which is he wanted to rid London of prostitutes. One thing I have to mention is Alec Newman's voice acting for Jack the Ripper. He really knocked it out of the park voicing him. When it comes to voice acting, especially in a game that mixes real history with fictional stories, you've got to get the voice acting just right to bring someone as complex and dark as Jack the Ripper to life. Newman did exactly that, and he was fantastic. His portrayal had this very eerie, spine-chilling vibe that was a perfect match for the foggy streets of Victorian London. You know, whenever Jack spoke, you could feel that chilling voice, which made every scene with him intense, especially near the end of the DLC where he's chasing you whilst taunting you.
Jack the Ripper cannot die! That woman thinks you're mad! Free yourself! Kill that mad woman!
It's some pretty scary stuff. I will say, the little details really stood out. Now what I meant by that is accuracy. I'm not talking about the fact that Jack was an assassin. I'll talk more about that later. But what I mean is the murder locations. You see, the crime scenes where Evie checks out the real life Whitechapel murders are pretty spot on. It did certainly seem like Ubisoft really dug into the history books to get the details right. They even nailed the Ripper letters and the phony suspects that the journalists of that time hyped up, which Evie had to prove wrong. If you're not really aware as to what the Ripper letters are, what I mean is during this time in real history, a bunch of letters were supposedly sent by the killer. Of course, the police got loads of letters from all sorts of people trying to stir up trouble, but a few stood out and are still famous today, like the Dear Boss, Saucy Jackie, From Hell and the Open Shore letters. They all seem different handwriting, different styles and different word choices. To be honest, most are considered bullshit, but some details were too spot on to ignore. So the little details like that which Ubisoft incorporated have to be commended. So while it's clear that they tried to keep things as accurate as possible with the setting, just like in the main game, I did feel like they kind of missed a chance to really honor these women. You know, if they had mentioned some details about the victims' lives, it would have shown much more respect to the actual women involved. Now, just going back to Jack the Ripper himself, I absolutely enjoyed the idea Ubisoft put out where he was once an assassin and part of the Brotherhood. Yes, I get it, that he was in real history very mysterious, but you have to remember that this is a franchise about fiction. Nothing is 100% accurate here, kind of like the whole Yasuke situation for Assassin's Creed Shadows, which I don't even want to entertain. But yeah, the idea of Jack being a former assassin is very cool and brings a very new twist to the usual tales about this infamous serial killer. Imagining Jack as a once promising member of the British Brotherhood of Assassins, especially being mentored by Jacob, adds a whole new layer to this villain, and for the main characters Jacob and Evie, it creates this emotional connection tying them all together. Now let's talk about gameplay, because I've rambled a lot about the actual premise of Jack the Ripper's character and whatnot. So first off, the most obvious part of the DLC that we get presented with is mainly playing as Evie Fry, and interestingly, you don't get to play as Jacob at all, which was a different change of pace compared to the base game. However, on top of just playing as Evie Fry, you also play as the actual villain of the DLC itself, Jack the Ripper, which I thought was an incredible concept. Now, as I mentioned earlier, since he was an ex-assassin, this translates throughout his movement, his combat, and just overall feeling of playing as him. I do like how the gameplay does not change that much while in the perspective of Jack. He's just as agile and skilled with the rope launcher as any elite assassin. What's unique though is the HUD. It's completely revamped. Instead of these standard bullet point objectives, the goals now appear around Jack in a kind of spooky ghost-like font. It almost feels like the game is channeling his inner thoughts with eerie commands such as kill them all. And speaking of kill them all, I like the little details surrounding assassinating random NPCs. The game practically scolds you. I guess the reason for this could be that the real Jack the Ripper did not kill random people, only the targets he sought to take out. Now please don't get that twisted with me saying Jack the Ripper was a good person. Let's just get that out the way. There is also the fear system that must be talked about. You know, whether it's bombs, stakes, screams, and very brutal takedowns. The whole point of these tools is to scare the enemies so much that they just turn and run, essentially instilling fear into the people of London. For example, you can drive a stake into an enemy, pinning them to the ground, and their screams will send others sprinting. Now it's not just Jack the Ripper himself that has this fear system, but Evie has her own version of it too, but hers seems to be more non-lethal. I guess while she was living in India, she must have picked up some pretty interesting intimidation techniques to take down enemies, without actually having to finish them off, kind of moving away from the usual assassin stab first approach. The fear system they've introduced for her is pretty straightforward. Startle your enemies and they get anxious, making them more aggressive, but hit them with another scare, like literally nailing one of them to the ground, and their anxiety turns to outright terror. They'll bolt, not looking back. I honestly love this fear system, and the fact that we're apparently going to see this return in Assassin's Creed Hexa is quite promising. It's getting harder recently to sell this secretive group of assassins as the good guys. In terms of the world or where this DLC takes place, you're pretty limited to only being able to explore Whitechapel and the city of London on the map. In the base game, I really enjoyed a few side activities, but unfortunately, they did not carry that same standard over to the DLC. For instance, the child liberation missions from the main game, which use the vertical layout and open spaces of multi-floor factories, are pretty much replaced by brothel attacks, where you rescue prostitutes from gangs. There is also a ton of stuff to find in this DLC, from a whole bunch of collectibles to various side missions. You can dig into the mystery behind fake Jack the Ripper letters, or even take down fight clubs by beating up their toughest guys. I feel like if you're a person that wants to do 100% of everything, then you're definitely in for a decent chunk of gameplay, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much more of the same as the base game. So that brings me to the end of the video. The Jack the Ripper DLC is, in my opinion, at least a top 3 in the franchise. But let's be honest, the DLCs in Assassin's Creed have never been groundbreaking. If we put them up against something like The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine DLC, they really do not compare, and I think that's always going to be the case. The best we've seen might be an Origins DLC or this one. They're good, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't pay more than $15 for them tops. Let me know what your thoughts are on this DLC in the comments below. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and with that said, I'll see you in the next one.